One of the long running themes of the war in Ukraine has been Russia's difficulty in getting troops where they need to be, when they need to be there. In a single sentence, this is why Ukraine won the Battle of Kyiv in 2022, and it is therefore why the war continues today. Still today, Russia is having problems there. And, moreover, the Kremlin's inability to implement basic command and control may have just opened up a new Ukrainian counterattack. But this is a complicated story that requires some background. Yes, today's problem involves this guy, Elon Musk, or at least his company, SpaceX. I know that he seems to resurface in the conflict every 6 months or so. Well, apparently it has been 6 months. Specifically, we are focusing on the SpaceX product called Starlink. On the surface, Starlink is a service that provides internet access to locations that cannot reliably get online. If you have ever spent time living in rural neighborhoods far from a major city center, you have experienced this problem. Maybe you can get online, but good luck communicating at speeds necessary to do normal 21st century business. The wired services, and even cell service, struggle out there. Starlink solves the problem by sending signals from space. If you have an incredibly large amount of capital to spend, you can put a whole bunch of transmitters way up in orbit. They solve the distance problem because the curvature of the Earth does not matter much when you are aiming up and down, as compared to trying to use cell towers going from side to side. So, if you simply buy a terminal, you can get online without much additional hassle. Of course, if you are watching this channel, even if you were unaware of Starlink before today, I bet you are already thinking about Starlink's applications in wartime. On the more innocent side of things, it simply allows civilians to get online. All sorts of infrastructure has been destroyed in Ukraine during the war, but Russia has not yet targeted things in space, though you will see by the end of the video why that is an ongoing concern. This image perfectly encapsulates everything about civilian life over the last 4 years. It is from Kupiansk, shortly after Ukraine retook the city in the fall 2022 counteroffensive. A generator is powering an ungodly number of devices, and everyone is on their phones, connected via the Starlink terminal. Actually, at the beginning of the war, a key goal was to simply ship as many Starlink terminals into the country as possible. This image is of 2 government officials in Kyiv with a bunch of Starlink boxes. One wonders if boxers are good at unboxing. Starlink can also be useful to open communications when governments, say, do not want their citizens communicating with the outside world. In fact, there are reports that the United States covertly smuggled 6,000 terminals into Iran, ostensibly to allow protesters to communicate with each other and broadcast videos of government repression to international observers. Thus began cat-and-mouse games with the government trying to locate and shut them down. And it turns out the only reason that I heard about this was thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Ground News. Yes, as I was writing the script for this video, I was casually browsing my daily briefing, and sure enough, there was the report, right next to a related story about US space dominance, which Ground News shows me is something not being covered in left-leaning outlets. It is nice that I am well-grounded enough to learn about all of that, while staying apprised of the topic at hand. And by going to ground.news/linesonmaps, or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can take a fantastic 40% off Advantage plan, which grants you access to all of these tools and more. So thanks again to Ground News for their continuing support of this channel. Anyway, you have also likely realized that Starlinks may be useful for military purposes. At the end of the day, they are a means of communication, and officers and soldiers up and down the chain of command need to communicate with each other. Again, rewinding to the start of the war, US sanctions on Russia immediately restricted sales and use of Starlink in Russia. The use part was easier for the United States to cover. Starlink satellites communicate with their terminals, and so they know where on Earth those specific terminals are. It is therefore easy enough to geofence Russia, and suddenly the associated terminals do not work. The sales part is trickier. Like virtually every other good, sanctions merely stop bilateral sales of Starlinks. They do not completely stop Russia from obtaining a particular product. Indeed, Dubai seems to be a primary intermediary, where Emirati companies legitimately buy Starlink terminals from the West, but then they turn around and sell them at a markup to Russian purchasers. These companies risk secondary sanctions from the West, but implementing those secondary sanctions is always easier said than done. It is both a logistical problem to track down all of the offending companies, and it is a political problem to get enough support to pay the enforcement costs. In any case, once in possession of a terminal, Russia still has the geofence problem to deal with. But they can get around that problem if the Starlink terminal gets sent into Ukraine, which is not geofenced. For example, Starlink technology has reportedly been found in a down Shahed drone. The precise purpose of the Starlink tech in it is unclear, though one imagines it is to improve communication and positioning. However, the more common use case is for Russian soldiers to bring Starlinks to the front lines and use them as a way to guarantee communications with command. As you likely know, Russia operates almost exclusively on a top-down basis, so not much can happen without that communication. Now, Starlink does not work in Russian-occupied areas like Crimea, but get close enough to Ukraine-controlled Ukraine, and it starts to work again. I know that this says something about Russia's own military shortcomings, that they are relying on technology from a US business to conduct basic military operations, but that sums up where the Kremlin is in 2026. In fact, Russia has tried to work on a native system, but it keeps getting delayed. Given the budget shortfall that the Kremlin encounters year after year, it might not be surprising that such a complicated project gets put on the back burner. And, at least for a while, Russia could rely on Starlink for frontline communications. SpaceX's geofencing solution did not work there because Ukraine is also using Starlink for the same purpose. By now, we all know that the front line is more of an expanded gray zone of fog of war soupiness than a well-defined breakpoint, so Starlink cannot constantly update its geofencing without also harming Ukrainian soldiers. That is more or less where things stood as of a couple of weeks ago. Now, however, SpaceX is implementing a couple of new solutions. One, to address Starlink use on Shaheds, the company will no longer give service to terminals moving faster than 75 kilometers per hour. The assumption is that anything moving faster than that is a drone. That indeed will kill their utility on Shaheds, as Shaheds need to fly much faster than that speed to stay airborne. The second part of the solution is more interesting. Now the geofence has expanded to include Ukraine. But to keep the Ukrainian military and civilians operating as before, Starlink has a whitelist program. Send your credentials to the company, and your specific terminal will work. The goal here is to have the best of both worlds. Both sides of the Ukrainian civil-military divide still reap the benefits of Starlink, while Russia gets none. And, indeed, from Ukraine's perspective, the immediate aftermath of the shutdown was phenomenal. Oftentimes on this channel, we talk about how the pivotal moments of a war are not when good or bad things happen. It is when good or bad things happen unexpectedly. When a city like Bakhmut falls to Russia, for example, it does not suddenly create deeper problems for the rest of Ukraine. Ukrainian planners are aware that Bakhmut will eventually fall, and begin planning for the associated contingencies way in advance. Thus, Russia raising a flag over Bakhmut is more of a period at the end of a sentence than the beginning of a new chapter. On the other hand, when something unexpected happens, the benefiting side can take advantage of the lack of opposing preparations. That is exactly what happened here. Immediately after the Starlink blackout, Russians took to Telegram to voice their displeasure about the chaotic situation that it has created along the front lines. Or at least they took to Telegram for some amount of time. It is now under some type of restriction in Russia for unclear reasons. Something to keep in mind over the next few weeks. The upshot for Ukraine is an unusually stagnant front line, as Russia needs to pause and develop new standard operating procedures moving forward. It also appears to have permitted a localized Ukrainian counterattack along the front in Zaporizhia, east of the Hook in the Dnieper River. This was not one of Russia's main axes of advance, but Russia always needs to worry at some level about Ukraine trying to cut off the Crimean land bridge. To add further intrigue, Russian mill bloggers are claiming that a broader Ukrainian counteroffensive is in the works there, while on the other side of the coin, others claim that there was less of a counterattack in the region and more of a self-correction. Russian troops had exaggerated their local gains, and Ukraine's recapture was less of a move of the line and more of a re-recognition of what was always the case. To situate these actions in the broader context of the war's momentum, Russian gains peaked in November of last year, slowed considerably in December, and then dropped off a bit further in January. One would expect the Starlink shutdown to further drop Russian gains in February, though one might also expect there to be a rebound come March as Russia adjusts to some new communications procedures. There is also weather to account for, both now and in the spring, but let's avoid going down that rabbit hole today. The other point worth noting here is that Ukraine claims that Russian casualties in December and January were both in the 30,000 to 35,000 range. Thus, for the first time, they roughly matched Russian recruitment rates. And it is all the more surprising that Ukraine hit those marks without Russia capturing as much land in November. Well, remember that the surplus manpower is what contributes to Russia making those larger gains previously, so Russia may very well be looking at a lower baseline regardless of what is happening with Starlink. To close out, I have one final point that nicely ties together the topics of Starlink and elevated Russian casualties. A natural solution to Russia's problem is to try to falsely register the Russian-controlled Starlink terminals as Ukrainian, so that they may continue to work as before. Well, the counter strategy is to then honeypot Russian soldiers by posing as politically ambivalent Ukrainians willing to sell activation codes for the right price, perhaps 30 shekels, in reference to the price that the Romans paid to Judas to sell out Jesus. You can then pass along location information to Ukrainian commanders, at which point the terminal's operators can be greeted with a warm explosion. Again, these are one-time opportunities. They will not have long-run effects on these numbers, but they are the types of things that Ukraine needs to continue to take advantage of to slow the Russian offensive, and get this war to a point that Russia will have to sue for peace under terms acceptable to Ukraine. If the last year has shown nothing else, it is that mere shuttle diplomacy is woefully insufficient to achieve those goals. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to take a fantastic 40% off Advantage plan. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Take care.